And to that extent, I think the truth has to have the same kind of basis.
And so this is why I had to examine the manuscripts and the background of the New Testament. And so the first question is, what is the timeline between the original, the autographa, and the closest copy? You see, the rule of thumb is this: the closer the copy to the original, usually the greater the accuracy. That's the rule of thumb. Now, it's not always true, but the overwhelming majority of the time, it is true. But see, that question has a problem behind it. And the problem was this: literature of antiquity was written on material that would perish. Much of the New Testament manuscript, like a lot of other literature of antiquity, was written on, it's similar to this here. It's called papyrus. And this is made up of the papyrus reed, which is grown in the very shallow waters of the Nile. And they take these reeds, they would slice them, and then they would place them crisscross, as if you look carefully here, you could see that. And then they'd put a glue on it, and then they'd press it together. And it's amazing. It really came out to be a very strong paper. Now, here was a problem. No matter what they did back then, the material would not last. It was not durable. It would start to rot away. And to show you how sensitive papyrus is, there was an archaeologist that found a portion of the Gospels in a cave. And it was on papyrus. And it had been there for hundreds of years. But the mistake he made, when he took it out of the caves that had been sealed, and certain moisture had been sealed and everything, he took it out into the desert, and he held it up to the light to look like this, and it disintegrated. That's why even like the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept behind tinted glass with a certain temperature and everything, or they disintegrate. And the reason you don't have originals is all the material would rot away. And so that's why you have the bibliographical test. Here you have, say, this is the original, and this is a copy. How far is the copy removed from the original? There's many ways to determine the very age of a manuscript. One, and probably the best way, is the type of material that it's written on and its age. For example, if it's written on parchment or pottery or the skin of animals or from papyrus, which I already described, in studying that material, you can pretty well determine within a few years of when that manuscript was done, or that portion of a manuscript. Another way is by the division of the text. See, a lot of people don't realize that originally the text was not divided the way that we have it in the Bible today. Over the years, they would divide the text or even begin or end the verse at a different place. And so by studying the division of the text, you can narrow it down to a few years when a manuscript was done. And then if you ever picked up an old book and you're looking at the beginning, and maybe the first letter is kind of ornate or artistic, or there'll be a picture there, a drawing, a graphic. And by studying those, in the manuscripts, they did the same thing. And by studying those, you can pretty well determine in a close proximity the years in which a manuscript was done. This morning in my home, I had a friend over, and I said, look what I found. It was a book handwritten back 1,500, almost 500 years ago. And as I opened up, he says, oh, look at the drawing. And see, it's that drawing that often you can determine the age. Those are just a few ways to determine how old a manuscript is. Now, one thing that I've learned over the years, the more I compare the scriptures with other literature of antiquity, the greater appreciation I have of the scriptures in comparison. For example, with Pliny the Younger, known as Plinius Secundus, from the time he wrote to the closest manuscript, everything else rotted away and lost, 750 years. With Caesar, wrote his Gallic Wars in the 1st century. From the time Caesar wrote to the closest manuscript, 1,000 years from the time he wrote. With Plato, from the time he wrote the closest manuscript, 1,200 years. Aristotle wrote his Poetics around 343 BC. The closest manuscript is 1100 AD, 1,400 years later. Everything in between has been lost. Sophocles, 1,400 years. Euripides, 1,500 years. But when it comes to the New Testament, just the New Testament, we now go back within about 50 to 70 to 75 years. And now with some of the new discoveries, they're saying even taking it all the way back to the 50s and the early 60s, which would be within 20 to 30, 35 years. You have the John Ryland papyri, a small portion found in a cave in Egypt that was preserved over all the years, about 125 AD, within 80 years. Then you have the Papyri Bodmer. Now, why is it called papyrus? It's written on papyrus. The Papyri Bodmer II, right around 155 AD. And then you have the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus. So they sound like diseases. Well, these are titles given to some complete copies of the New Testament. Just time-wise, there is more evidence in the manuscripts, time-wise, for the New Testament than any 10 pieces of classical literature combined. And then, with the second question, the first is the timeline. The second question is very critical, and that's this one. How many manuscripts do you have? Say, what do you mean? Well, the greater numbers, say this is the original and here's the copies. The greater number of the copies that you have, the easier it is to reconstruct the original, the autographa, and check out any errors or discrepancies. One of the complaints is, well, you don't have the originals. Well, of course you don't have the originals. Jesus walked and lived on the face of the earth 2,000 years ago. And back then they didn't have the papers I've already described that they have today. But it's not whether do you have the originals or not, but do you have the copies where you can recreate the originals? And this is what I was talking about. That we do have the copies, we do have the material. To me, it totally satisfies my mind that we are able to recreate the original. In fact, you take the Nestle's New Testament Greek. It's probably about half the size of my Bible here, and thicker. And any question in doubt that what we have today was not the original, now think of this, in the Greek, Nestle's New Testament is less than 1/2 of 1 page. Now, when that comes to literature of antiquity, that's miraculous. That's phenomenal. And so the issue is not whether do you have the originals. I mean, at that time, nobody has the originals. The question is there sufficient manuscripts to recreate the autographa, the original? And with the New Testament, I say, yes, we do. Now, in comparing with secular literature, for example, Caesar and the Gallic Wars, 10 manuscripts. But nobody in university questions that Caesar fought the Gallic Wars, and for a long time he was the only one that ever survived that wrote about it. 1,000 years, the closest manuscript after he died, and there's only 10 manuscripts. Of Plato, 7 manuscripts. Of Tacitus, the Roman historian, right now there's less than 20 manuscripts that have ever survived. And then Thucydides, many people consider Thucydides one of the most accurate historians of antiquity. And yet there's only 7 manuscripts. And those are 1,300 years after Thucydides died. Herodotus is 8 manuscripts in about 1,400 years. With Pliny the Younger, there's about 7 manuscripts. With Sophocles, 193, which is one of the most. Euripides, 9.